Center for Action and Contemplation presents a homily by Father Richard Rohr.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel as written to us by Matthew. And Jesus said to his disciples, "If your brother or sister sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won over your brother or sister. If they do not listen, take one or two others along with you, so that every fact may be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses even to listen to them, tell the whole community. If he refuses to listen even to the church community, then I'm afraid you must treat him as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that you are agreeing to pray on, it shall be granted to you by my heavenly Father. For wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in their midst." This is good news from the Lord. There's so many different themes introduced between the 3 readings, I'm really not sure what would be most profitable for you. What I certainly see is a deep and early understanding of community and of relationship. You see in the second reading from Romans, where Paul is basically quoting Jesus, although he doesn't say so, to say that all of the commandments are summed up in the one commandment: love your neighbor as yourself. We call it the golden rule. That's the only thing you finally owe God and owe one another is love. It's so simple and so straightforward that frankly most people just ignore it. We'd rather have some concrete little things to worry about instead of that hard and wonderful thing of honestly being in love with our neighbor in mind and heart and body. That's work. It's real work. And so even though Jesus said it, even though Paul said it, we try to make Christianity into something other than love of neighbor and love of God. Then in this gospel from Matthew 18, Jesus himself really brings it home. Although there's actually 3 different little lessons here. The first one is what we today call an intervention. You know, when someone really is doing some stupid things and they're destroying the family, themselves, the community, it's really very wise advice that a modern psychologist or counselor would probably agree with. First, to save their pride, to not humiliate them unduly, why don't you just talk to the person? Now, you know, most of us don't do that. We talk to everybody else about the person. That's called triangulation, or quite frankly, gossip. And I find Christian communities are pretty much as bad as anybody else. We talk to everybody else about what so-and-so has done wrong instead of going directly to them and saying, is this true? Or could we improve on this? Saying it in a kind way to let the person save their pride. Our job is never to humiliate or defeat another person. But frankly, if they write you off, get out of my way, okay, if it's a serious enough issue, then you have to have what we call an intervention, where 2 or 3 people sit down. Joe, we don't want to pick on any Joes in the audience, but Joe, what you're doing is not good. It's much harder for people to be defensive or reactionary or say cruel things when they have to say it in the presence of 2 or 3. But in fact, some people still do. especially addictive personalities or narcissistic personalities who are convinced they're absolutely right and can accept no criticism. And we have a lot of people like that, you know. So then it says, take it to the whole church community. Now, frankly, I don't think we have any structures for that. Most Catholics just maybe, perhaps, run to the priest, but in all truth, he isn't the whole community. So this third level is really not very workable, which means maybe church has some growing to do, to understand how we can have ways of solving problems in the collective, by group prayer, group discussion, and even perhaps group intervention. The irony is, he says, if they don't listen even to the group, then treat them as you would a Gentile or a tax collector, which your first thought is, well, get rid of them. Actually, if you listen to Jesus, he says to treat Gentiles and tax collectors very nicely. So I'm not sure what the message is, but I think it might well be, even if they don't listen, you still owe them respect. You don't shun them or exclude them or punish them. Then, that next verse, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. If you're a good Catholic, you grew up applying that to the Pope, didn't you? Do you see here? In Matthew 16, he does apply it to Peter. But here in Matthew 18, the very same verse is applied to every Christian. That you have a certain kind of power. When you speak truth, if it is God's truth, then God's going to back it up. So I'm afraid we haven't been very honest with you as Catholics to admit this is not just the role of Peter, it's the role of every Christian, to have that kind of authority that wants to speak, when it speaks in love, of course, with the very authority of God. Then finally, what is Matthew's really first and most primitive definition of church? It isn't this great big Roman Catholic assembly that you and I have grown up with, which is largely anonymous and unaccountable one to another. You know, you can say you belong, but it really asks very little of you beyond coming to church on Sunday morning. It's not really an accountability system for anything. So again, we have a lot of growing up to do. But here is a very foundational definition of church. Whenever 2 or 3 of you are gathered in the right spirit, there I am. That's just as strong as saying I'm present in the bread and the wine, which we've tended to emphasize. But here it says, when 3 of you are praying together, loving together, being respectful together, Jesus is in your midst. We haven't emphasized that very much at all. What does this mean? That you can experience church in the true and deepest meaning of the term when you gather in love with your neighborhood, with your friends, and with your family. And maybe sometimes a meal that is shared in your house where there isn't any gossip, where there isn't any hatred, where there isn't any ill will, might be even a more compelling presence of Jesus than coming here to church filled with negative energy and negative thoughts about everybody who isn't just like you, which frankly is where most of our negativity goes. Anybody who isn't just like us. So let's move beyond that smallness that is never going to create anything good in the world, and let's live in this new presence, which is really the eternal presence that has been promised to you and to all the church.
This homily by Father Richard Rohr is copyright by the Center for Action and Contemplation. Visit cac.org for other educational resources and programs.